The seating card said, Halloran, and it was placed at the main table, third chair from the head. Simone Voss picked it up at 6:52 that evening, read it and set it down at table 9, the round one by the kitchen doors where the noise came through every time a server pushed past with a tray. She did it herself. She didn't ask anyone. It took 4 seconds. Then at 7:20 in front of 31 people holding drinks, she looked at the man in the brown corduroy jacket standing near the window with his 8-year-old daughter and said clearly, "I'm sorry, are you with the AV company because we're going to need this side of the room?" He said he wasn't. She said, "Then you've been moved, table 9. And honestly, there's a family room off the lobby if she'd be more comfortable." The man looked at the card in his hand for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." He put down his water glass. He took his daughter's coat off the back of the chair, and he walked out of the Chandler room at 7:26 p.m. and drove 28 minutes home and read 2 chapters of a book about a girl who trains falcons and turned off the light. At 12 a.m., the Voss-Fenn merger, $2.4 billion, 18 months of work. The deal that was supposed to define Simone Voss's career died on the table because the one signature it required had gone home to put his kid to bed. He never raised his voice. He never told her who he was. He just left, which turned out to be the only thing in the world that could destroy her. Ray Halloran had a scar down the middle of his chest that was 11 inches long, and he had spent 14 months learning not to touch it in public. He was 44. He'd been a pipe fitter until he was 26, then a project foreman. Then, through a series of decisions that had felt small at the time, and enormous in retrospect, the man who owned 70% of Voss Industrial Group, a $4 billion maker of industrial valves and flow control systems, headquartered 11 blocks from where he was standing. Almost nobody knew that. It was in filings if you knew where to look under a holding entity called 9Bell LLC. He had never given an interview. He had been photographed in a business context exactly once in 2016 badly from behind. He had not planned any of it. That is the part people never believe. The short version is that Ray Halloran's father-in-law was a man named Bernard Voss, who built the company and who did not like his own children. Bernard Voss had 2, a son who wanted the money without the work, and a daughter Ellie who wanted neither, and married a pipe fitter, which her father took as the personal insult it partly was. Bernard spent 9 years not speaking to Ellie. Then he got sick, and in the specific arithmetic that terminal diagnoses produce, he called her. Ray drove her to that house. He sat in the truck for 4 hours the first time, and then Bernard came out and asked him about a pump problem at the Norwood plant, and Ray told him the truth, which was that his engineers had specified the wrong seal material and everyone on the floor knew it and nobody wanted to say so. They talked for 2 years. Not warmly. Bernard Voss was not a warm man, and Ray was not the forgiving type about what had been done to his wife. But they talked. And when Bernard died in 2011, the will did something nobody expected. It put the controlling block in a trust with Ellie as beneficiary, and Ray as trustee, with instructions written in Bernard's own hand, that were depending on how you read them, either a great act of faith or a last act of spite toward his own son. Ellie died in 2019. Ovarian cancer. 14 months, no warning at the start, and no mercy at the end. The stock came to Ray. He did not want it. He said so out loud to a lawyer in a room, and the lawyer explained that wanting had very little to do with it, and that 11,000 people worked for the thing he now controlled, and that walking away was itself a decision, with consequences he would not be able to unmake. So he did the only thing he knew how to do, which was work. He kept his job. He ran commissioning for a mechanical contractor, and he kept running it, and he still ran it now. And he voted his shares once a year, and he hired professionals, and he stayed out of the building. For a while that had felt like humility. Then, 14 months ago on a Tuesday, in a parking lot outside a job site in Hamilton, Ohio at 6:41 in the morning, Ray Halloran's left anterior descending artery closed, and he went down between 2 pickup trucks. A 23-year-old apprentice named Dev Rasmussen, who had taken a CPR class 9 weeks earlier because it was required, and because he'd been bored, kept him alive for 11 minutes. Ray woke up 2 days later with a tube down his throat and his daughter's drawing taped to the rail of the bed. Bertie was 7 then. She had drawn the 2 of them as stick figures holding hands, and above them, in the careful lettering of a kid who has just learned that letters are supposed to be even, she'd written "don't." Nothing else, just "don't." He'd asked her about it later when he could talk. She said she'd run out of room. He never found out what the rest of the sentence was going to be because she wouldn't say, and by the time she was old enough to explain, she'd forgotten. He thought about that drawing more than he thought about the surgery. Two things changed after the parking lot. The first is that he stopped being able to pretend that staying out of the building was humility. It was fear, a very specific kind, the kind where a man who came up on a job site does not want to walk into a room full of people who went to schools he didn't go to and find out he's a fraud. He'd dressed that up for 8 years. The heart attack took the costume off. The second is that he stopped dressing to be believed at all. Not as a philosophy. He just no longer had the surplus energy it required. He wore what was clean. He drove a 14-year-old Silverado with a cracked bedliner. He carried a phone with a cracked screen because replacing it was a task, and he had a limited number of tasks in him now. His cardiologist had told him, reduce load. Ray had privately translated that as, find out what's actually load-bearing. The answer had turned out to be very short. It was an 8-year-old girl who was currently obsessed with falconry, ate exactly 4 foods and had lost her mother at 4 and did not remember her, which was the fact Ray Halloran could not carry and carried anyway. He came to the Chandler room that night for one reason. Voss Industrial was buying a company called Fen Fluid Systems, family-held 410 employees, 2 plants in Kentucky. $2.4 billion. It had been in motion for 18 months, and it required under the shareholders' agreement Bernard Voss had written in 1994 and never updated the written consent of any holder above 60% delivered before the drop-dead date in the merger agreement, which was midnight. Ray had read all 1,100 pages. He had one question, and it was not a financial question. In the employee retention schedule, there was a 2-year guarantee for the Kentucky plants, and in the very next exhibit, there was a clause that let the buyer reopen it after 12 months for operational cause, which is a term that means whatever the person using it needs it to mean. He wanted to look at Tobias Fenn, the seller, 71 third generation, a man who was about to hand over the thing his grandfather started, and hear him say out loud that he understood what he was signing. And he wanted to hear Simone Voss say out loud in front of Fenn what she intended to do with those plants. Then he was going to sign the consent, hand it to the general counsel, and go home. He'd brought Bertie because his sitter had strep. He had considered not coming. He had a signed consent in a folder in his truck and a lawyer who would have taken it at the curb. But he'd been the guy at the Norwood plant once on the wrong end of a decision made by people eating dinner somewhere, and he had promised himself in a hospital bed 14 months ago that if he was going to own a thing, he was going to be in the room when it did something to people. So he put on the brown corduroy jacket, which was the nicest thing he owned, and which had belonged to Ellie's father, and he took his daughter to a private club. Simone Voss was not a Voss by blood. She had married one briefly at 26, and kept the name at 31 when she divorced him, which tells you most of what you need to know about the shape of her ambition, and also if you're generous about how few tools she'd been given. She was 51. She had run Voss Industrial for 6 years, and she had run it well, a fact that mattered because the story is not that she was incompetent. Revenue up 60%. 2 divisions turned around. She had personally saved the Norwood plant in 2021 when the board wanted it closed, and 400 people still had jobs because she'd been willing to spend her own credibility on it. She was also that night 49 days from the biggest thing she would ever do. Here is what made her dangerous, and it wasn't greed. Simone grew up in Butler County. Her mother cleaned rooms at a Marriott by the interstate and did the overnight shift so she could be home when Simone left for school. When Simone was 14, her mother took her to the hotel's staff Christmas party, which was held in a banquet room after the paying guests had gone, and there was a seating arrangement and the housekeeping staff sat at the tables closest to the kitchen doors. Simone remembered the doors. She remembered how they swung. She had spent 37 years since then getting to the other end of that room, and she had gotten there, and somewhere along the way, the thing that had been done to her had turned into a thing she did. That is the ordinary mechanism by which decent people become the problem. Not a conversion. A hardening in the shape of the mold. She did not think of herself as a snob. She would have used the word standards. She believed, and she had built an entire operating philosophy on it, that a room is a machine, that seating is signaling that where a person sits tells the other people in the room how much weight to give what that person says. She wasn't wrong about that. That's what makes it work as a story. Where she was wrong was in believing she could tell by looking who deserved which chair. There were 3 other people in the Chandler room that night who matter. Tobias Fenn 71, the seller, in a suit that fit him in 2009. He had spent 18 months negotiating and 4 decades before that running 2 plants, and he had come to this dinner not to celebrate but to look people in the eye, which is a thing old manufacturers do and young financiers do not understand. Peter Lindgren 39. Simone's chief of staff, who had been carrying a laminated seating chart since 4 o'clock, and who would in about 90 minutes make the worst professional decision of his life by saying nothing. And Inez Duarte 58, who had worked the Chandler room for 19 years, and who knew the moment Ray Halloran walked through the door exactly who he was, because he had been coming there twice a year since 2012 to have lunch alone with a woman from Voss's general counsel's office, and because Inez Duarte had over 19 years developed the single most accurate map of that building's real power structure, and nobody had ever once asked her for it. Cocktails were at 7, dinner at 8. The consent had to be signed and delivered by midnight. 5 hours. The card was the whole thing. Everything after it was just the card out loud. At 6:52, Simone did a final walk of the table with Peter Lindgren behind her. She moved 4 cards. 3 of the moves were ordinary: a banker next to a banker, a lawyer away from a lawyer he'd sued. The 4th was a small white card that said Halloran at the main table, 3rd from the head between Tobias Fenn and the general counsel. "Who is this?" Simone said. Peter checked the laminated chart. "Halloran. He's on the list from legal. Harriet put him on." "On the list is what?" "It doesn't say. Just the name." Simone stood there for a second with the card between 2 fingers. Now this is the moment. This is where the entire $2.4 billion turns, and it turns on something so small that nobody in the room registers it happening. She could have asked one more question. She could have said, "Find out." Harriet Nkemelu, the general counsel, was standing 40 feet away with a drink in her hand and would have answered in 5 words. But Simone Voss was 49 days from the biggest thing she would ever do, and she had a room to build, and the room needed to say a specific thing to Tobias Fenn, that this was serious, that these were principles, that he was handing his grandfather's company to people who belonged at that table. A name with no title on it was a hole in the machine, so she put Halloran at table 9 by the kitchen doors, and she did not think about it again. 4 seconds. She'd have told you under oath that she barely remembered doing it. Ray and Bertie arrived at 7:14. He'd told her the rules in the truck. "It's grown-up boring. You can have as many of the little bread things as you want, and if you need to go, you squeeze my hand twice and we go." "Can I bring my book?" "Yeah." "Can I bring the bird one or the horse one?" "Whichever one you want." She brought both. Inez Duarte saw them come in and cross the room before the coat check girl could. "Mr. Halloran?" She didn't say his first name in a room. She never had. Tables straight through. Would she like a Shirley Temple with extra cherries or the regular amount of cherries? Bertie said. "How many is extra?" 6. 6. Inez nodded like this was a serious negotiation, concluded well, and went to get it. "That's a small thing. Hold on to it. It comes back." Ray moved to the window side of the room out of the traffic because 31 people with drinks in a room is a thing that used to be fine, and now made his chest tight in a way he hadn't told his cardiologist about. He got a water. He found Tobias Fenn across the room and waited for a gap in the people around him. He was standing there, one hand on the back of a chair, his daughter next to him with a book about falcons, when Simone Voss came over. She had noticed him. Of course she had. He was in that room, a visual error, brown corduroy boots, an 8-year-old no drink, but water standing near the AV table, where the club's ancient projector cart was parked. She came over with a smile that was, and this is important, entirely sincere. "Hi, sorry, are you with the AV company? Because we're going to need this side of the room." "No, ma'am," Ray said. "I'm here for the dinner." The smile stayed on. Something behind it moved. "Oh, okay. And you're with—" "I'm on the list," which was true and unhelpful, and would not have been unhelpful if she'd asked one more question. "Right." Simone glanced down at Bertie and her voice softened, and the softening was worse than the sharpness. "Well, we've actually got you at table 9. And honestly, there's a family room off the lobby. They'll bring her whatever she wants. It might be more comfortable for her than sitting through the toasts." Ray looked at her for a moment. "She's fine," he said. "I'm sure she is." A small laugh. "It's a long night, that's all." She was already turning. And then, because the room was quieter than she'd registered, and because she was speaking at the volume of a woman who was not aware that anyone was listening except the person she was correcting, she said the sentence that would end her. Table 9's the overflow. It's just the main table's principles only. 6 people heard it clearly. One of them was Tobias Fenn. Ray walked to table 9 and found the card with his name on it. He stood over it for a second, and Bertie, who was 8 and missed nothing, said, "Is this our table?" "Looks like." "It's by the doors." "It is." "Do you want to sit here?" And Ray Halloran, who had never once lied to his daughter, said no. He'd have gone back to the truck right then, probably, if it were only about him. It wasn't. He had a folder and a question and an old man across the room who'd built something with his hands and was about to hand it to strangers. So he sat down at table 9 with his daughter and a Shirley Temple with 6 cherries in it, and he waited for a break in the crowd around Tobias Fenn. At 7:38 he got one and he crossed the room. "Mr. Fenn." He put out his hand. "Ray Halloran." Fenn shook it. He had a grip like a man who'd used his hands. "Halloran." He looked at him a beat longer than a stranger would. "You're on the list with no title." "That's me." "That usually means lawyer, or it means trouble." "Neither." Fenn's mouth moved slightly. "What do you do?" "Commissioning. Mechanical contractor, 22 years. Something in the old man's face opened up about 4 millimeters, which for a man like Tobias Fenn is the equivalent of an embrace. "Which side? Design or field?" "Field." "Then let me ask you something," Fenn said, and he leaned in, and for 90 seconds 2 men talked about seal materials and pump alignment in a room full of people discussing multiples. That was the moment Simone Voss looked over and saw the man she had just moved to the overflow table standing shoulder to shoulder with the seller, having the only real conversation in the room. She read it exactly wrong. She read it as a problem. She came over with Peter Lindgren half a step behind her. "Tobias, I see you've met." She paused 1 beat too long, and it was a beat you could hear. "I'm so sorry I didn't get your name." "Ray." "Ray." She turned to Fenn with the warmth turned all the way up. "Let me get you over to Harriet before dinner. She's got the schedule questions you asked about." "In a minute," Fenn said. Simone kept smiling. She put a hand lightly on Ray's arm, not aggressive, almost friendly. A hostess redirecting traffic, and said quietly, but not quietly enough, "There's actually a photographer coming at 8 for the table shot, so if you could give us this side of the room, that'd be great." Ray looked down at the hand on his arm. "You want me out of the photo?" he said. Not a question, not angry. He was checking a measurement. "I want the table shot to be the table," Simone said, and she said it lightly, and it landed like a dropped plate. Peter Lindgren looked at the carpet. Harriet and Camelou. The general counsel, who was 11 feet away and had just turned around, went completely still because she was the person who had put Halloran on that list. And she was at that exact second doing the arithmetic that everyone else in that room would not do for another 4.5 hours. She started to move. She did not get there in time. 2 people intercepted her, a banker with a question about the wire instructions, then the club manager about the timing of the toasts, and it took her 90 seconds, and by then, it was done. Here's what broke it. It wasn't the seat, and it wasn't the photo. At 7:52, a server came out of the kitchen backward carrying a tray, and the door swung and caught the back of Bertie's chair, and she jolted forward, and about a third of the Shirley Temple went across the front of her dress. She didn't cry. She got very quiet, which with Bertie was worse. Ray was up and over there with a napkin in about 4 seconds. The server, a kid maybe 20, was apologizing in a stream, and Ray said, it's fine, not your fault, that door's a hazard, it's been a hazard for 19 years. Which was true, and Inez Duarte, arriving with club soda and a stack of napkins, said, 19 years is right, and knelt down next to Bertie and said, you know what this dress needs, club soda and a professional, that's me. And Simone Voss, arriving from the other direction, said, okay, this is exactly what I was worried about, there's a family room off the lobby. I'd really like you to move her before the toasts. The room heard that one too. More of it this time. Ray straightened up with the napkin in his hand. He looked at Simone Voss for what people later described as an uncomfortably long time. Inez Duarte, who was closest, said afterward that his face didn't have anger in it. She said it had recognition, like a man who had been checking a gauge for an hour and had finally gotten a stable reading. Because he had. Here is what Ray Halloran was actually doing all night, and it wasn't enduring humiliation. It was collecting data. He had come to that room with one question. What would these people do to the 410 in Kentucky when the 12 months were up, and nobody was watching and it was just a number on a page? He had asked it in 1,100 pages of legal language and gotten 1,100 pages of legal language back. And then a woman had answered it in about 90 seconds in front of him by demonstrating precisely what she did with a person whose usefulness she could not immediately identify. She moved them away from the doors that mattered. Politely, sincerely, without ever raising her voice. "Okay," Ray said. Simone, misreading it as agreement, said, "Thank you, really." He was already picking up the coat. At 7:47, before the dress and before the doors, there was a toast. Simone gave it standing with a glass, and it was good she was good at this, and it ran 90 seconds, and it was about legacy and family companies and the responsibility of taking care of something somebody else built with their hands. 410 people in Kentucky are going to wake up tomorrow with a bigger company behind them, she said. That's not a line item to us. That's the whole reason we're standing here. The room applauded. Tobias Fenn looked at his hands during it the way old men do when someone is describing their life back to them. And at table 9 by the doors, a man in a brown corduroy jacket sat with a folder in his truck outside, containing the one signature that made all of it real, and listened to a woman say the exact sentence he had come there to hear, 12 minutes after she had moved him out of the photograph for not looking like he belonged in it. Bertie leaned over and whispered, "What's a line item?" Ray said. "It's when you turn a person into a number so it's easier to do something to them." Bertie thought about that. "That's mean," she said. "It's fast," Ray said. "That's different from mean. It's how most of it happens." There was one more moment, and it deserves its own accounting because the story would have ended completely differently if a single person had spent 4 seconds. At 7:55, as Ray was buttoning Bertie's coat, Peter Lindgren, Chief of Staff, 39, 4 years in the job, walked over to Simone at the bar and said quietly, "Should we find out who that is?" And Simone Voss, who had a room to build and 49 days to go, and a cellar to get in front of a photographer, said, "Peter, if he were somebody we'd know." Peter Lindgren nodded and went back to his laminated chart. He would repeat that sentence verbatim in a deposition 8 months later, and it would be read aloud in a courtroom, and it would follow both of them for the rest of their working lives. Ray Halloran walked out of the Chandler room at 7:26 by the club's clock and 7:58 by everyone else's. The club's clock was slow, and this became absurdly a disputed fact in litigation. At the door, Inez Duarte handed Bertie a paper bag with 4 of the little bread things in it and said, "For the road, ma'am." Bertie said, "Thank you." Inez looked up at Ray and said, "Mr. Halloran," and then stopped because she had spent 19 years knowing exactly where the line was and telling a room what it had just done was on the other side of it. Ray said, "It's all right, Inez." "It isn't," she said. He drove home. It took 28 minutes. Bertie fell asleep at minute 19, which was normal, and he carried her up, which 14 months ago he had not been able to do, and he sat on the edge of her bed and read 2 chapters of a book about a girl who trains falcons out loud to a kid who was already asleep, which is a thing parents do for reasons that have nothing to do with the kid. The signed consent stayed in the folder on the passenger seat of a 14-year-old Silverado in a driveway in Loveland, Ohio. Nobody called him. There was no reason to. Every person who might have called him was at a dinner watching a photographer set up a table shot. The low point of this story belongs to a woman named Harriet in Kemalu, and it happens at 11:04 p.m. in a car. Harriet was Voss Industrial's general counsel. She was the one who had put Halloran on the guest list with no title, because that was the arrangement. It had been the arrangement for 11 years, and she had honored it through 2 CEOs, and she had never once written the words majority holder next to that name on a document that would circulate. She had spent the dinner trying to get to him and being intercepted. By the time she got free at 8:20, table 9 was empty, and there was a paper bag of bread rolls missing from the sideboard. She told herself he'd gone to the restroom. At 8:50, she told herself he'd taken his daughter home and would sign in the morning, and then remembered that there was no morning because the drop-dead date was a date, and midnight was midnight, and a merger agreement does not care about anybody's evening. At 9:15, she called him. It went to voicemail because the phone was in a jacket in a hallway in Loveland, and its owner was asleep in a chair. At 9:40, she called again. At 10:20, she left the dinner without saying goodbye to anyone, got in her car, and drove to Loveland, Ohio with a folder of documents on the passenger seat and the specific nausea of a lawyer who can see the shape of a thing arriving and cannot make her car go faster than the law of it. She got there at 11:04. The house was dark. There was a truck in the driveway. She sat in the car for a full minute because there is a version of a legal career that ends the moment you knock on a client's door at 11 at night, and there is another version that ends if you don't. She knocked. A porch light came on. Ray Halloran opened the door in a t-shirt with his reading glasses pushed up on his head. "Harriet." "Ray?" She held up the folder. "I need your signature, and I need it in the next 56 minutes. Ray looked at the folder. Then he stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door most of the way shut behind him, because his daughter was asleep, and he said no. Harriet Nkemelu had known him for 11 years. She had never heard him say that word. "Ray, do you know what happened tonight?" "I know some of it." "Then you know I'm not signing that." She did the thing lawyers do, which is to lay it out flat. 2.4 billion 18 months, a $200 million break fee, 410 Kentucky employees who would now be sold to somebody else or nobody, a stock price that would open in a hole and stay there, and a seller Tobias Fenn, 71, who would have to go back and tell his family the deal was dead. Ray listened to all of it. He was very still. "Say the last one again," he said. "Fenn goes home and tells his family it's dead." Ray looked out at the yard for a while. "That's the part I have to live with," he said. "I know that. I'm going to be carrying that one for a long time." "Then sign it." "Harriet." He turned. "I went to that room to find out one thing. Whether the people running my company would honor a promise to 410 people in Kentucky 12 months from now when nobody's watching and it's inconvenient." He held up 2 fingers an inch apart. "I got my answer in about 90 seconds. Not from the documents. From what she did to a kid with a stained dress at a table by the kitchen." "That's not the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing," Ray said. "It's the identical thing at a different scale. That's the whole point of it. If you'll move a person you can't identify for the sake of a photograph, you'll close a plant you've never visited for the sake of a quarter, and you'll do both of them politely, and you'll never once think you did anything wrong." Harriet stood on the porch with the folder in her hands. "You could have told her who you were," she said. "At any point. 1 sentence. Ray, you had the sentence." And this is the line that ended up in a business school case study which Ray Halloran hated. "If I have to say it," he said, "then it doesn't work. The whole thing only tells you something if she doesn't know." Harriet Nkemelu drove back to Cincinnati and got there at 11:51 and told the room. She has said since that watching 31 people understand it simultaneously was the single worst 9 seconds of her professional life. At 12 a.m. under Section 8.1c, the merger agreement terminated automatically. Voss Industrial opened down 19%. The 8K went out at 6:02 a.m. and said in the flat, unbeautiful language of securities disclosure that the transaction had terminated because a required consent had not been obtained. It did not say why. It did not have to. The $200 million break fee did the talking. By 7:15, the question in every trading desk in the country was the same one Peter Lindgren had asked at a bar at 7:55 the night before and had been talked out of. Who is Halloran? They found it by 9 Bell, LLC, the 2011 trust. The 2019 transfer, the whole quiet architecture of it, sitting in public filings where it had been sitting for years unread, because nobody looks at a document that isn't a story yet. 70%. One man. A commissioning supervisor in Loveland, Ohio with a 14-year-old truck. The board convened at 11 a.m. Ray attended by phone from a job site in Hamilton wearing a hard hat, which is a detail that would have been unbearable if anyone had invented it. He did not make a speech. His entire recorded contribution to that meeting runs 11 lines in the minutes, and the substantive part is 4 sentences. I'm not going to characterize her conduct. 31 people were in that room, and you can ask any of them. What I'll tell you is that I asked one question about the Kentucky guarantees in writing 3 times through counsel, and I never got an answer that wasn't a clause. So I came to ask it in person, and I got an answer. I'm not comfortable putting my name on a document that hands 400 people to that answer. That's all I've got. Then he took himself off the call because he had a chiller startup at 1 o'clock. Simone Voss was not fired that day. That is a thing people always get wrong about how this actually works. She was not fired for a week. What happened instead was worse and slower. The board opened a review. Institutional holders started asking for calls. Two directors, including the one who'd championed her in 2019, began in the careful phrasing of people building a record to ask when exactly she had learned who Halloran was and what she had done in the interval. And the answer to that second question was the thing that ended her. Because at 8:20 that night, when Harriet and Kemalu had said, "Where is Ray Halloran?" Simone had said, and 11 people heard it, and 4 of them repeated it under oath. "The corduroy guy, I sent him to 9. Not I made a mistake. Not find him. I sent him to 9. She had been given a second chance at 8:20, a third at 9:15, a fourth at 10:20, and she had spent all of them managing the photograph. She resigned 9 days later. The statement used the word differences. Peter Lindgren was let go the same week, and his deposition, if he were somebody we'd know, became briefly a thing. People put on slides at leadership conferences, which he did not deserve and could not escape. Here's what Ray Halloran did about 6 weeks later, and it is the reason this story is worth telling instead of just enjoying. He bought Fen Fluid Systems. Not Voss Industrial, him personally, through 9Bell at a valuation about 11% below what the dead deal had been worth, which Tobias Fenn's bankers called opportunistic, and Tobias Fenn called Tuesday. The purchase agreement contained a Kentucky employment guarantee with no operational cause reopener, no 12-month window, and no defined term escape hatch. It ran 9 years. Ray's own lawyer told him it was the most one-sided document she'd ever drafted against her own client, and asked him on the record to acknowledge she'd advised against it. He acknowledged it and signed anyway. He also called the $200 million break fee the most expensive thing I've ever bought, and paid it out of the trust, which is a sentence that made 3 financial reporters physically ill. Was it a good trade? Financial press spent a year arguing about it. In year 3, the Kentucky plants were the second most profitable unit in the group, which proved nothing except that Tobias Fenn had known what he was selling, and everyone else had been reading a spreadsheet. Ray took a board seat, his first at 44 after 11 years of not taking one. The first thing he did in that role was small and got no coverage. He had every guest list for every company event stripped of titles. Everyone's card just says a name now. If you want to know who somebody is, you have to talk to them. The second thing was smaller. He had the swinging kitchen doors at the Chandler room replaced with the kind that don't swing. He paid for it himself. Inez Duarte still works there. She says it was the single best-received capital improvement in 19 years. Simone Voss did not go quietly into a better life. That is a thing stories do, and people mostly don't. For about 5 months she fought it. She hired a crisis firm. She had a version, a good one actually, in which she was a woman who had run a company well for 6 years and been destroyed by an anonymous billionaire's undisclosed vanity test. And there were people, serious people, who found that version persuasive because it was not entirely wrong. She gave one interview. It ran in a trade publication, and she was careful and controlled, and she said the phrase, "I was never given the information I needed," and the interviewer, who was good at her job, asked, "Did you ask for it?" Simone said, "There was a lot happening that evening." She watched the piece go out, and she read her own quote, and she did the thing she had not done in 37 years, which was hear it. If he were somebody, we'd know. She had not said that one. Peter had, but she'd taught it to him. It was hers before it was his. There's no clean scene where she breaks. That's not how it goes for someone with that much armor. What happened was that she stopped fighting in October quietly without telling the crisis firm, and spent about a year being unemployed in a way that was financially comfortable and psychologically unsurvivable. And in that year, she went back to Butler County twice, and the second time she drove past the Marriott by the interstate and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. Simone had bought her a house in 2014, and her mother had lived in it and been proud of her, and never once in all those years asked what she was actually like at work. She wrote Ray Halloran a letter in the spring. 4 pages handwritten, which for a woman who dictated everything was itself the point. She did not ask for anything. She did not ask for a job or a statement or a meeting. It was in accounting, this is what I did. This is when I could have stopped. This is what I told myself at each of the 4 points where somebody handed me a chance. She named the moments. She got them right, including 2 he hadn't known about. The last page was about the kitchen doors and about a banquet room in 1988, and about how long a person can carry a thing before they start handing it to other people. Ray read it twice. He didn't write back. Not out of cruelty, he thought about it for weeks, and drafted something twice, and threw it out both times because everything he wrote came out as either forgiveness he hadn't been asked for, or a lesson she'd already taught herself better than he could. He put the letter in a drawer. He did tell Harriet once that it was the best written document anybody had ever sent him, and that it had made him feel like a coward for a week. And when Harriet asked why, he said, "Because I never wrote one." 2 years and 1 month after the dinner on a Thursday, there was a lunch at the Chandler Room. Ray Halloran was there with 2 engineers and a woman from Fenn's Kentucky operation at a foretop by the window, arguing about seal materials, which was what he did with his good days now. Bertie was 10 and had moved on from falcons to owls, which he had been assured was normal. Simone Voss was there too. She was working a mid-tier operations role at a regional distributor 2 counties over, a job that paid roughly what she'd made at 31 taken 11 months earlier, after a long stretch of people not calling back. She was there with her boss and 2 clients. Her boss was 34. She was carrying the folder. They were seated at table 9. Nobody did that on purpose. It's a room with a certain number of tables and a lunch service, and table 9 is where a party of 4 goes at 12:40 on a Thursday. The doors don't swing anymore, so it isn't even a bad table. She saw him before he saw her, and she did what she had gotten good at over 2 years, which was keep her face still and keep working. Inez Duarte saw both of them and said nothing, and refilled the water and went back to the station and stood there for a second with a pitcher in her hand. At about 1 o'clock, Ray got up to leave. His table was going. He had a plant tour at 3. He came down the aisle past 9 with his jacket over his arm. A different jacket, the corduroy one, had finally gone, and he slowed. Simone looked up. 2 years is a long time. She had rehearsed a number of things in the way you do in cars, and at 3 in the morning, and none of them were available to her, and what came out was, Mr. Halloran. Ray stopped. Everyone at that table was now watching, including a 34-year-old boss who had no idea what he was looking at. And Ray Halloran, who had been thinking about a letter in a drawer for a year and a half, said, "There's 4 of us at the window, and we've got room. If you all want the table, it's better light." That was it. That was the whole thing. He didn't say her name. He didn't say anything about a dinner or a merger or a seating card or forgiveness. And he never did, not that day, not later, not once. He offered her a better table in front of her boss in a voice with nothing in it but the ordinary flatness of a man mentioning that a chair is free. Simone Voss said, "Thank you, we're fine here." And Ray said, "Sure," and went to his plant tour. She sat back down. Her boss asked who that was. She said, "Somebody I used to work with." And then she put her hands flat on the table for a second, the way you do when a room is moving, and got through the lunch and drove back to a distributor in a county she'd spent her whole life trying to get out of. She has never told that story to anyone. The kitchen doors at the Chandler Room don't swing. The guest cards don't have titles on them. And there is a man in Loveland, Ohio, who owns 70% of a $4 billion company, drives a truck with a cracked bedliner, and has an 11-inch scar down the middle of his chest that reminds him every morning in the mirror exactly how much time he has to be the kind of person he says he is. He has never once told anybody in a room who he was. He's found that it's the only way the answer means anything.